Welcome to Science Right Now. And today I'm interviewing these three excellent authors about their recent novels. We've got James Bradley, author of Ghost Species, got Donna Mazza, author of Fauna, and Chris Flynn is the author of Mammoth. And each of these books is about extinction. So James's book is about the recreation of a Neanderthal child. And Donna's book is similar. That's about the birth and the pregnancy of an engineered child. And then Chris gives voice to these animals that have gone extinct and they've been dug up and put on display in a museum and they're all really bored. So each of these novels is interesting in and of themselves. But what I find remarkable is that they've come out in the year of the plague. And you must have been thinking about these ideas for at least a couple of years. So I want to know when you started thinking about them, and I know it's coincidence that they've all come out in this year, but where did the seeds germinate? Let's start with you, Donna. I know you've taken a couple of years to put this together and you've done a couple of iterations beforehand. So when did you start thinking about engineering children? And
it was probably around 2012 or 2013, and I came across the idea in National Geographic, reading about the de-extinction and the potential to do that with the mammoth. And I was reading about CRISPR at the same time and the potential for CRISPR to revive extinct species. And I put the idea together myself that, you know, for that to transfer into the human population would mean that there would need to be a human mother involved. If that human mother was involved, what would it be like? And what would that experience be like to bring up a child like that? So I started working towards that idea from there and published it as a short story in 2015 with Westerly. And I had such a good response to that story that I continued to develop the idea, and I've written a whole series of short stories around similar ideas which have been coming out variously in different journals and things, and in New Australian Fiction, Kill Your Darlings, which is this one. That's sort of been it's part of a bigger project across all of similar ideas. And so the novel I started to write in 2017, and it came out in a big rush. So I had been reading around it and reading the science around it for about 5 years beforehand.
Okay, yeah. Why did it come out in a rush?
Because I don't have a lot of time to work on my writing.
Okay.
And so I'd been researching and reading and writing short stories. And then I had this period of time that was available to me. And it was like, you know, when you kind of build up a head of steam and then it just kind of came out in a big burst. And I was really glad to have it come out that way, because I feel that momentum is really important to pursue, that it really needs that energy behind it.
Yeah. James, did you have a similar gestation period, excuse the metaphors? How long were you thinking about this? Did you, and like Donna, did you do any kind of small pieces that built up into this book?
No, not really. I mean, I guess for me, I was thinking less about the de-extinction stuff initially than I was about a series of questions about kind of climate catastrophe and the way we think about it. And I was thinking a lot about that kind of sense of derangement, of temporality, that sense that of the kind of thinning of the world. And I guess I was casting around for a way to kind of write about that. And I'd been writing a novel which was about a kind of a very close kind of bond between mother and child. And I think at some point I suddenly thought, oh, look, you know, what happens if the child is not human? And kind of went from there. But in an odd kind of way, I came to it not through the process of thinking about any of those questions about de-extinction and stuff, although I had been reading about them. I was actually thinking about a series of kind of environmental questions and thinking about kind of geoengineering schemes to kind of reorganize the climate and things like that. And it became, I guess it kind of grew out of that. So I kind of came into it from a slightly different direction, I suppose.
So was there any one thing that gave you that idea about mothers and children and that bond?
I'm not sure that there was. It's a bit embarrassing. I don't actually. I remember having the moment where I went, "Oh, it could be a Neanderthal child." I actually don't remember what it was I was doing when I had that moment. I wish I had a more compelling story about it. But I think that motif of mothers and children and families is really interesting because it is one that is absolutely omnipresent in this fiction. I've just read, in fact, another book which is about mother-child bonds, and there does seem to be something about, over the last 5 or 10 years, if you've seen more and more fiction, I think, engaged with these questions around climate and environmental catastrophe and things like that. What you've seen is people developing a series of kind of thematic, ideas that they talk about it with, and clearly that question of kind of families and the disruption of the family, the kind of way that the bonds between parents and children are expressed and I guess disturbed has clearly become a really powerful way that people think about that, because you see it turning up over and over again, both in kind of my fiction but also in in lots of novels in this area, I think.
Yeah. And I think it's a good, well, personally, I think it's a good metaphor for thinking through our relationships with not just other humans, but other living things on the planet, like trees are our kin, basically.
Yeah, and I think all of that, those questions of kind of kin that, people like Donna Haraway and people talk about are very important. But I suspect also it's something about time. I mean, I think there's something about thinking about children, thinking about parents. It's one of those things that places us in a relationship with the past and the future. And at some fundamental level, lots of these questions that we're asking when we're writing books about climate, when we're thinking about climate, when we're thinking about the environment, are about those kind of relationships between the past and the future. Like, what is our relationship to future generations? What is our relationship to past generations? And those kind of ideas that you see talked about kind of, various indigenous cultures that think many generations into the past and future, but also I think there's an idea in Indian culture about we always think 7 generations into the future. Yeah, so I think it's one of our ways of thinking about that, about our relationship to the future.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Chris, you've set your novel in 2007, which I thought feels like ancient history. Plague distorts our sense of time as well. And then you delve back into the 19th century when everyone was really excited about fossils. So what made you choose that particular time period? And you go back, but you also go forward in the last couple of chapters as well.
It's kind of scary to me that Donna said that she was reading an article about de-extincting the mammoth, and then she started writing a book that was sort of obliquely related to it. And obviously I was doing the same thing at the same time, and James was doing the same thing at the same time. And in fact, all of our books come out the same year. And in fact, with James and me, our books came out on the same day. They were released on the same day, which is really freaky. Thank God we didn't all just write exactly the same book. That would have been embarrassing. The start of the 19th century is a really compelling period to think about with regards to fossils, because it was a time in the history of humanity when a lot of bones are being dug up and people were asking questions as to how old they were and what kind of animals they were. And at that time, it's mentioned in the book, men of science, it was always men, of course, men of science and men of faith were the same men. The scientific community were often held quite strong religious beliefs. And so it's a fascinating time for those people, because they were unearthing bones from the alluvium that was challenging their conceptions of their faith, because the bones are obviously a lot older than what they thought the earth was. At that time, they more or less thought the Earth was about 6,000 years old, and suddenly these bones were definitely an awful lot older than that. And as soon as they began to think about that, it challenged quite a lot of the precepts behind their faith, because the notion first came up of an age of reptiles that predated the age of man, that man didn't always have dominion over the world, that there was a time before us, whenever other creatures roamed the earth. How was that related to God, to the Bible, to religion? It was a very difficult time for them to get their head around these things. And of course, the earth was constantly being reclassified at that time as to how old it was. So I thought that was an interesting period to talk about. And the mammoth bones feature in the book were on sale at a natural history auction in 2007 for real. And those bones were dug up in 1800 at the behest of President Jefferson, who wanted to show the world that America was a fabulous new democratic project that had huge creatures that once walked plains. He wanted to show that the world of America was great. And it kind of speaks to that origin of the Republican notion of greatness and pride and arrogance. So it tied in nicely with the modern world and what was happening in our world at the time.
Yeah, very temporal. Yeah, very relevant. And you have this really interesting way of talking about that history, which is through the dead animals. And it's a very funny book, which I think is interesting given that everything's, collapsing around us and things are dire. Are all your books funny, or was that just a choice you made for this particular book? Because you've got this mammoth who's kind of ponderous, and then you've got the Tyrannosaurus matar who's providing light relief. And there's a really arched tone throughout it. Was that deliberate, or you just couldn't help yourself?
Well, it was deliberate. It was deliberate because it was deliberate because I couldn't help myself. I kind of struggle just being deadly serious in my fiction. I'm writing another book at the moment, and it's I'll be sitting in silence for like an hour writing a passage in which I haven't smiled once, and then I'll think, what am I doing? I need to make people laugh. I have this terrible sort of paralyzing comedic sort of thing inside me, and maybe it's an Irish genetic thing, I don't know, where I feel like I need to be making people laugh, and it's kind of annoying because I shouldn't be doing that all the time. Damn it, I need to be more serious, but as soon as I came up with the voice of the mammoth, you're right, he's kind of ponderous, he's full of himself, very boring, really. And to purposefully have a boring central voice of a character is a bit of a risk for a novelist. So I made sure that the other characters in the auction house, the other bones, had quite different voices according to when and where they were dug up. And so that allowed me to ascribe a sort of human personality to the bones and have them banter between each other, and also question him as to how he could possibly know some of the things that he knew. So there's a bit of a meta narrative going on there about authorial voice and how can characters, that's a thing. As a reader, I'm constantly knocked out of narrative whenever I come across something and think, wait a minute, he wasn't there. How did he know that? So he does it on purpose. He talks about things he couldn't possibly know, and then the other characters pull him up on it. So I had a bit of fun with the form as well as the voice in this book.
Yeah, I thought it was a clever way of bringing in the research and without it being too heavy. Yeah. And Donna, you've got a first person narrator. It's told from the point of view of Stacey, who's the mum who goes through the birth. I thought that was really interesting because you talk about the grittiness of having a child, especially a child that's been engineered, and how difficult it is to bring up a child. And I was wondering again why you chose that technique. Why did you choose first person to write about Stacey? in the book. And it's a really feminist way of talking about science too. I thought that was really exciting. And I was wondering if that also fed into your decisions about presenting the research.
I'm quite comfortable writing in first person, and I often find myself naturally writing in first person. It's also written in present tense. And I think that's probably because I use a lot of empathy in my writing, and especially because I'd been doing so much reading around the scientific parts of the story. And I didn't want to get caught into that trap of writing something that has that kind of didactic scientific content. And so choosing that sort of narrative position of Stacey in first person allowed me to talk from that really empathic place of motherhood and tap into that emotional space of connection with that kind of physical process of pregnancy and the whole physicality of motherhood and, you know, that early period of breastfeeding and all of that stuff. So I felt like the empathy was the best antidote for the science, and you know, that tension between the science and the mother is really important, I think, to the story. And I do think those things are in some kind of tense position with each other in life, really.
Can you know, what do you mean by that?
You know, even though those decisions that you make as a contemporary parent now of going and volunteering to have scans and blood tests and, you know, being monitored and all of those processes that you go through as a mother in that position, even going through childbirth and the interventions of medicine. And it's a very, you know, it's an area that's fraught with all kinds of complexity, because each decision that you make along the way is a decision that, you know, may have some impact on the fate of the pregnancy. You know, you don't go and have tests because you don't want to find something out. You have tests because you want to find something out. And if you find something out that you don't want to know, then what does that mean for the fate of that child that you're carrying? So even as the contemporary parent, we make decisions along the way every time we go in and have a scan or, you know, go through those processes. So I really wanted to interrogate that stuff a little bit, because having been through experiences myself in that area, I do feel like it's a place where feminism needs to sort of stand up a bit more. You know, there's a lot of work to be done in that area, I think, for women.
Oh, that's interesting. And also the impact the class plays in the decisions as well, because your family are an ordinary suburban family. They don't have a lot of resources. Yeah. So I thought that was fascinating. Yeah.
I mean, I find that stuff really interesting, and I think underexplored in Australian literature.
Yeah.
You know, that kind of sort of lower middle class.
Yeah. I wonder if writers just can't afford to be writers anymore. So that's why we're losing those kinds of voices. You've got to have, you know, some support to write your books. It's not there.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Good point. Yeah. And James, you used a third person voice that was focalized through particular characters. So you've got Kate, the mum, and then you have the daughter Eve. And I was interested in Eve and how you researched and thought about presenting her view of the world. For example, she's got heightened sensory capacities when she's out in the bush. So how did you come to write her character and also Kate's character? Were they modelled on any particular research that you did, or just came into your head, or?
Look, so Eve's character, the Neanderthal character, is one of the, as you say, she's one of the perspectives in the novel. So for about half the book, she's the main perspective that you're seeing the book through, and that was really deliberate, because I didn't want her to be, I guess, a kind of subject in the novel. I didn't want, I wanted her to have her own voice and to be there and to be a kind of presence in the novel rather than just something we were looking at. And I guess in order to kind of bring it to life, I mean, I kind of read the stuff that you read. One of the things that's interesting about all the Neanderthal stuff, and I'm sure Donna would say something similar, is that there's quite a lot of science, but everyone kind of argues about what it means. And so, you know, did they have language? Didn't they have language? What was their language like? Could they sing? You know, what was their vision like? And we know all kinds of really specific things about how long they breastfed for and things like that. But lots of the kind of interpretation of the kind of stuff that matters to you when you're writing about the character, like what were their cognitive abilities like? Did they have symbolic thinking? Like lots of those kinds of things. There's a lot more debate quite clearly amongst the scientists about what's the case. And I, you know, to be fair, I think a lot of that debate is driven by, it's really obvious when you look at the science of how we think about Neanderthals that the way we conceive of them has traditionally been about things we want to think about ourselves. So they begin as these kind of brutes that live in caves, and then by the 70s they become flower children who commune with nature. You know, I mean, so there's this sense that they kind of change through time. But I eventually just decided to take a series of assumptions about what she was going to be like. You know, so as you say, her vision's a bit better, her smell is better. And some kind of cognitive stuff. There's some stuff in the literature a few years ago, although I think in fact the science has moved away from this now, which suggested that one of the reasons Neanderthals were less competitive with Homo sapiens was that they were not as good at handling large groups of people. So Homo sapiens are very good at being in very large groups, but the argument was that Neanderthals lived in smaller groups because they were not as good at handling large group dynamics. And you know, so she struggles a bit with large groups of people. You know, so there's some kind of stuff like that I did about kind of making assumptions about what she was like, and then I tried to, I guess, kind of just make her a person within the context of that. And there was very much that was very much a process of trying to, I guess, as I said before, I didn't want her to be a subject. So there's things like I didn't want her to speak in a clumsy way, you know, because I felt like that would make it harder. It would kind of do something to it that I didn't want to. Interestingly, I know in Donna's book she does, and there it's extremely effective, but in a different kind of way. So my version of her is reasonably articulate. You know, her formation of language is perhaps not all it might be at a kind of mechanical level, but at a kind of, she's perfectly able to use language. So I did a series of things like that about kind of making assumptions on the basis of the science and then kind of going with them.
Yes. Where did you find the science? Was it in magazines? Did you have access to academic journals, or did you speak to professionals?
So I read some books. I did some stuff online. I contacted an academic at one point who writes in the area and said, "Oh, look, you know, I'd really love to have a chat with you for half an hour or so about some stuff." And the academic came back to me and said, "I charge $500 an hour for my time." And I felt, as a display of collegiality, I would perhaps not do that. So no, I just made it up really on the basis of what I'd read.
Yeah, this is something that I'm interested in because I'm an academic for at least, I know, a couple more years maybe. And so I've got access to the literature. But if you don't have access to the academic literature, I was just interested where else you go.
Well, it's really difficult. I mean, and in fact, I've actually just become attached to a university as an honorary associate, which has been fantastic because I suddenly have access to the university library, which has been absolutely transformative for me. Like I can just look stuff up now rather than having to, you know, beg friends to get it for me or buy the book or, you know, so that's been great. But yeah, I mean, I guess I kind of read books, but yeah, no, I was a bit shocked by the academic who did that to me because I was kind of like, I mean, as a writer, you're constantly giving your time to other people, and you know, people come to you all the time saying, "Can I talk to you about things?" And you say, "Of course," you know, or sometimes you say, "Look, I'm too busy," but usually you just say yes, you know. So yeah, you know, she wanted to charge me lots and lots of money to talk to me for half an hour.
I don't think that's ethical. Academics get paid by taxpayers to produce stuff.
I would have seen it as part of your outreach personally, but you know, it's like she obviously didn't. You know, maybe she gets asked all the time.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Chris and Donna, how about you? How did you access your research? Was it easy or difficult? Did someone charge you $500 to?
I'm not saying another word until you pay me $1,000 for this event. The research was fun for me because I mean, James and I have talked about this separately. This idea of, you know, trying to appear as professional as possible as an author whenever the research you're doing can seem desperately haphazard sometimes. And you try to follow a bit of a formal process, but often you just veer off wildly at a tangent and end up somewhere else. Probably the most formalized aspect of the research for me would be, as I was writing the story, I realized that I had huge gaps in my knowledge about certain aspects of history or certain subjects. So then I think, well, I'll need to go and inform myself a bit better with regards to that. And I would go down internet rabbit holes as far as I could go sometimes, but often they will lead you to primary sources, I guess, because someone will have written some obscure article on an obscure website referencing a university press book that came out in 1997 that's no longer in print. And I would think, shit, I kind of need to get my hands on that book. And so I would spend time on, book websites ordering out of print, and eBay and so on, ordering out of print old books that probably the academic who wrote them never imagined that someone would be chasing them up 20 years later, trying to get a hold of it just so they could read a chapter about the bones of a prehistoric penguin, but that's what I did. And so I would sometimes just have to wait for books to arrive in the mail and then go through them. And it's a bit bad really, but I'd write all over them and make a mess of them as I would pull out the notes that I needed. But sometimes it would just be I would do all that just to be able to complete a few pages in the text, because I wanted it to seem like I actually knew what I was talking about, because the whole time I didn't really think that I did. So I guess when you're a novelist, there's that, you're a bit of an actor, you're talking a good game and you're telling everyone about the book you wrote and all the research you did and how hard you worked, but you're kind of just feeling your way in the dark a lot of the time. And it's not that you're making it up as you go along, but sometimes you do. And also you sometimes don't know you're going to need something until you need it. So I would think that I had all my bases covered, and then I would get to a point and think, oh, wait a minute, I don't know anything about the origin of bourbon. And all of a sudden my character in a bourbon distillery. So I need to find out about that. But then there's a certain joy and pleasure to be had in that, because not just in the imbibing of bourbon as research, but also the reading of books to find out about a subject that you knew nothing about and that you never thought you'd have any interest in before.
Well, you're an expert now, so.
I think that's going a bit far.
You can claim it on tax for those books.
That's right.
Yeah. Donna, how about you? Because you're quite technical in some of your writing. I found. Well, it sounds like you are. How did you go about doing that?
I used, much like James, I think I used a combination of books that were around, journal articles that I found, podcasts, the science show on ABC Radio National, all kinds of stuff fed into it. And I guess what I did was just, accrued little bits of information that started to piece together a picture of what an individual might be like. And just used that kind of combined information and took imaginative leaps for the bits that were gaps.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, as a writer, I think that's what you do. So it was a kind of combination of research and those imaginative leaps. But, I also did things like, I went to the Australian Museum in Sydney and they had some skulls. So they had some different models of human skulls. And I sat down with a pen and designed a hat to fit the skull so that I actually had the right hat for my character. And, I've got a drawing of it at home. So I kind of made her a sort of designed her own wardrobe. So that was part of the process, kind of fun, you know.
Yeah.
But how else do you do it?
How would I do it?
Yeah.
I haven't got to my sci-fi novel yet. I've been working on that for quite some time. I got interrupted by my postdoc. And that's about mermaids and deep time. So I have to research fish, and I realized that humans can only go down to a certain level before your lungs are crushed. So I need to go talk to some experts about how a mermaid can breathe underwater. What happens to your skin when the sea becomes too polluted. So yeah, it's the same thing, posing a series of questions that you've got to answer in the course of writing it. But I'm also wondering if the scientific research changes the trajectory of the plot as you're writing. I don't know if any of you found that while you were researching.
I had done a lot of the research before I started writing the novel because, you know, the nature of my work-life balance is that I have more time to read and research than to actually immerse myself in the writing. And so I had done a lot of research before I actually started writing it over a period of time. And I had a really clear idea of the developmental stages. And so I had the structure of it already mapped out as far as the kind of lifespan of the early childhood lifespan. And so I had that all kind of structure associated with that from my research, which I used to build the whole structure of the novel.
Oh, okay. Yeah. How about you other guys? James and Chris, do you have it all mapped out? The scaffolding done? Or do you...
No such thing as scaffolding in my house. I would love to be able to do that. My brain seems to work in a desperately random fashion that I can't make head nor tail of, which is frustrating because I do try to structure my drafts and then I'll start in on it and halfway through realize, wait a minute, this is not the right version of this at all. I'll find the beginning of the book halfway through the book and then realize that everything I've done before then I didn't actually need, and it was just my brain working something out, and it was a bit of a preamble for me. So yeah, I'm trying as I progress in my career to work out a process that will somehow cut down the amount of time that I take, but not having much luck with that yet.
James, how about you? Do you work it out as you go?
Yeah, I mean, it depends a bit on the book. So I'm writing a book at the moment that's basically a crime book, and that's involved having a much better sense of the mechanics of what's going on because you kind of can't write it without it. But with this one and more normally, look, I tend to know what I want it to feel like. I tend to know what I want it to sound like. So a kind of sense of, I guess, the kind of texture and feeling of the book. And then I'll often have a couple of moments or characters. And then I kind of write bits until I find something that feels like it's working. And then I start stitching it together until I have something that resembles, you know, something that's got a kind of beginning, middle and end. And then I go back and I kind of tidy it up. But it's a very intuitive process. Intuitive is a polite way of putting chaotic, would probably be close to the truth. But it's very much about, for me, about looking for a kind of, you're looking for kind of rhythm, and you're looking for energy, and you're looking for, I guess, those kind of moments of kind of feeling, and they're what you're kind of writing towards. And once you've kind of got them, you arrange the stuff around it. So, I mean, I tend to know, like, I knew in this one, there was a kind of moment of collapse. Like I knew there were a couple of things that would happen in the book, and then I just kind of write stuff, you know, and often I write stuff from the middle at the beginning just to see how it's going. So,
Yeah, I kind of start anywhere as well, and I just write, and then I kind of move everything around until it works.
Yeah.
Chris, yeah, you want to add something?
I have a question. Since the three of us are together in an event for the first time, and James just sent a little ripple down my spine there when he said his next book was a crime book, can we just confirm that the three of us are not working on the same book again?
What are you working on, Chris?
Yes, let's talk about this. I'm working on a sort of epic end of the world book that's set in 4 different countries.
Okay, so mine's a crime novel set 30 years from now, so it's all right.
Thank God for that.
Donna?
Mine's set 30 years from now.
Oh.
And it's on the southwest coast, and it involves environmental stuff. Yeah, environmental stuff. So it's not particularly crime. No, there's no crime involved.
No.
I haven't got crime fiction. Yep.
No. Mine is kind of, actually I'm writing 2, but this one is it's a kind of, it's crime in a climate changed world, if that makes sense, you know, so yeah. Not like you're either of them. That's good.
Good. We should have some sort of register that all authors go on to just say, this is the idea I'm working on, please, no one...
no one take it.
No one take it.
But I mean, Donna, I mean, it is really weird, that thing, because Donna, I must say one of the worst moments of my year last year was when I got the email from Alan Nunman with the description of your book. And I was like, oh my God, this sounds like my book. You know, it was an awful moment, but we were already so far down the, but what's really weird, because I have read Donna's book, and which I liked very much, but it's really fascinating to me, not just that we're using lots of the same research or anything like that, it's that there's so many kind of parallels in the books themselves. Like both of them the mothers have got these kind of disturbed childhoods with these narcissistic mothers. Mine's got there's a section where she kind of abducts the child and removes it. Like there's so many things that happen in both novels. It's really, really strange that there's so much.
Isn't it?
And it's odd because they're completely different books, but there's all these weird correspondences within them. It's really fascinating, actually.
Well, didn't they invent the light bulb in 2 places at the same time?
Yeah. Yes, I suppose.
It's just testimony to it being a very potent idea. And, you know, there is something esoteric about the whole creative process.
I suppose, but it is really interesting that there's, yeah.
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 I had a bit of a freak out too, because I read both of them and they were similar in so many ways. I'm going to write an essay on it, just giving you advance notice, to chart the similarities and the differences between them. But what I did find striking was the interference of institutions. And Chris's book is about institutions as well, but particularly the gender play in those institutions. So I felt like the mothers were kind of manipulated into this position. And it's kind of like women like to be nice to people. They don't want them to feel bad. And so, but they were kind of manipulated into this position of having a child by a kind of institution that is started by, you know, wealthy white blokes. Sorry, excuse the white blokes there. And that they didn't seem to have any agency, yet when they had the child, there was such a deep bond between them. And I was wondering, are you replicating a structure that's already there? Or are you trying to do something different with those mothers and their children? Or is this just a question out of left field, the thing that literary critics find that authors don't really think about? This is the problem I had as an academic too. I'm a creative writer, and then I go and teach literary criticism, and I know writers don't think about this stuff, they just do it, and then literary critics come along and find these patterns. So yeah, I thought the gender dynamics were very interesting, and I was wondering if they were conscious or not.
Not for me. Well, in some ways, I guess, the whole kind of role of the mother and the situation of the mother and being you know, part of a medical experiment, I think was interesting to me, and I wanted to explore that. And, you know, thinking about any other creature that's involved in a de-extinction program, there's always going to be a mother involved.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think that it was worth investigating the whole role of motherhood and what might happen to it under these circumstances.
Yeah. Listen, James, in your book, the mother doesn't actually give birth, it's a surrogate. And I found the way you wrote the surrogates kind of disturbing, because there was no affect. There was just her and the pregnancy. And then they took her, I better not give anything away in case people want to read it. I don't know. But it was, and so the baby, the mum takes the baby and nurtures it as if it was her own. And I found the dynamics shifting, going on, quite affecting. Because I really felt for Eve, and I felt for her mum. But it's still this really clinical environment that she'd been removed from. So I was wondering where those choices came from, again, if they were intuitive or if you're just, I think what writers do is they tap into what's happening in a culture as well. Yeah, and like Donna says, it's not always planned.
No, I mean it's interesting. The bit with the surrogate is supposed to be disturbing, so I'm glad it's disturbing. She is meant to be a disturbing character. I mean, I think one of the things I think is incredibly impressive about Donna's book is the way it handles all of the stuff around reproductive technology, which I think is, you know, really at a kind of granular level, incredibly cleverly done and very convincing and very, very powerful. And I must say, when I was reading it, I was thinking it's really odd because you've got these two books where so many things are the same, but in an odd kind of way. Mine's really a climate catastrophe book. You know, it's just the Neanderthal stuff is a way of getting to that story and a way of thinking about some of those questions about temporality. So, you know, and it's about a whole lot of other things about grief and extinction and things like that. But in an odd kind of way, those questions about reproductive technology were not really the ones. I mean, they're kind of there in the book, and they're certainly, it touches on them, I think, but they're not the things that were what I wanted to write about. Like, I wanted to write about that bond between the mother and the child. I wanted to write about kind of breakdown and collapse and what that might feel like. I wanted to write about that sense that time is really profoundly out of joint, and about kind of the loneliness of Eve, that kind of sense that you are an isolate in a way that's kind of almost unimaginable. So, you know, I think in an odd way I was coming to it, like the book does that thing where it looks like it's about one thing, but it's really about something else. Does that make sense? But I mean, you asked before about families, and I was thinking about that. It's actually really interesting because this book, Clade and The Deep Field, my second novel, are all novels which are at some level about the creation of families, kind of non-biological families. And in all three of them, they're families which have been, I guess, kind of, there's a degree of kind of technological intervention in that family. So it's kind of funny. I don't know that I'd thought about it as something that was kind of a theme in my work before, but now that you've said that, perhaps it is. I mean, that kind of sense of the family as a creation as well as a kind of biological unit, because all three of them are, you know, there's these kind of families that are assembled out of non-biological relatives.
Chris Olsen once said to me, by the time you're on your second or your third book, you can see all the problems that you have.
Oh, yeah. Oh, totally. I mean, and there's a level at which you find yourself just writing the same book over and over again. You know, I mean, I know that I got to a point where with my books where I was not allowed to have anyone turn out not to be who they said they were at the other end of it.
Yeah. But going back to that, the mother-child bond, Donna had that fantastic scene or description in your book. The cells of the baby go into the mum, and the mum is changed by the baby. I thought it's so clever. And also that word fauna, which is a classification of an animal, and the book is about the hinge between animal and human. Where did the title come from? Did that just pop into your head, or?
It did, because that's a big turning point in the novel. There's a big turning point when they have that realization that she's not really a human, and what is she?
Yeah.
And it was just a point where lots of questions suddenly started to kind of coagulate, and so that point I felt was really important to highlight and give the title to the story. That stuff about the crossover of cells from the placenta through the placenta into the mother is something that happens during pregnancy. And so with each pregnancy that a woman has, her cells change slightly because there is this kind of absorption of cells from the fetus. And I thought that was a really kind of potent thing to explore in the light of what was happening to Stacey in the novel.
Yeah.
And how she is altered slightly by having this pregnancy, and you know what that might actually mean. And I think that it comes out psychologically. The intention was that it came out psychologically, that kind of shift, that she's somehow different to what she was before.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just think it's fascinating that we actually, the more we find out about even what's inside us, how our perception changes of life and all of the things that are around us, you know, how we absorb the things that are around us. And it's just, I felt like those things as I wrote it, it wasn't just all the research I did before, but the things I encountered as I went through it and started to read about different subjects as well, kind of stuck to it. And the story evolved through, you know, just whatever I happened to come across at the time.
Perfect metaphor for writing.
Yeah, well, it is, because you kind of, you know, I guess the whole pregnancy and writing have a lot of things in common.
Yeah.
And we do sort of shift and change ourselves as we write something. You know, I feel that, you know, my own cells are in the book.
Yeah.
There is this kind of crossover that happens. And you know, as I was writing it, I used a lot of empathy when I was writing this, and I was very involved emotionally in the whole process of pregnancy and childbirth as I was writing it, so much so that as I was writing the childbirth scenes, I had contractions and had a hot water bottle on my stomach because of the way it made me feel, you know. So, you know, there is all that part of it. It's not just scientific research. That's just like a layer in there. I feel like it's a layer of a many-layered process.
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah. And the ideas that you're talking about are seismic, the ones that we're addressing with society as well. And James's novel brings those things up. And so does Chris's. Like Chris, you talk about the idea that these bones are changing the way people think about science in the 19th century as well.
And also the DNA that they're recovering from carcasses in Siberia. I mean, there's an entire mammoth carcass was discovered in 2006. It still had its flesh and sinews and hair, and it was bleeding whenever they got it out of the ice. So they're able to collect blood samples and have viable DNA. And you know, James and I were talking about this yesterday, but they've just announced on Saturday in the Siberian Times, that paragon of journalism, that they've discovered an entire Ursus spilauus, which is a cave bear, an intact specimen of a cave bear, the first one they've ever found. And it looks like it just died. It's a pretty scary looking thing. And so they have viable DNA for that. So according to the science, they should be able to recreate these creatures in the lab. And going back to what Donna said earlier about the idea of motherhood and bringing up a creature, if you like, that is not your species, that's exactly what's going to happen, because the first generation of mammoth will be created in the lab, and then they'll be raised by African elephants until there's enough of them to breed naturally. And it'll be the same if they make a cave bear or a thylacine or passenger pigeon or whatever else they're planning on recreating. It's kind of scary though to think that they might create a cave bear. It's all very well having a passenger pigeon flying around. That's not what's the worst thing can happen, that it shits on your shoulder. but the cave bear will rip your head from your shoulders and eat it. So that's a bit scary.
What are your thoughts at large, all three of you, about the ethics of these programs? Something I think about a lot because I've got a disability. I'm deaf, so I can hear a little bit. And in the culture of disability, we have the history of Nazi eradication programs. So Action T4 was murdering people with disability by the Nazis, and then that became the prototype for genocide of Jewish people in World War II. So part of my unsettlement in reading these books was speciesism, which is pretty similar, or if not the same as racism, and the extermination of a species. And Chris, you talk about that in your book. They're trying to eliminate species. And I feel like some of you are writing about hope at the end of your books, particularly Chris and James, and Donna at the end of yours is really bleak concluding image. It's a little bit heartbreaking. And I feel like there's still a lot of underlying structural problems in our society at the same time that these very glamorous rehabilitation or de-extinction programs are carried out. So what are your thoughts on the ethics of this? And it's not even a case of whether you think it's right or wrong. Like you, in each of your novels, you're putting these ideas forth to get people to think and talk about them. Again, is that something you would deliberately try to address, or again, is it just tapping into a zeitgeist, or what are your thoughts generally on this?
I think it's good to talk about these things because the ethics of what's going on can often be quite troubling, and you do wonder if people are really thinking it through ethically. Of course, ethics gets thrown to the wind whenever, as you say, glamour comes into play, and I'm sure that if someone is able to recreate a cave bear or God forbid a Neanderthal, whether we think it's ethically correct or not, they'll probably do it anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, it might be a bit trickier to, if we're dealing with a Neanderthal rather than an animal, but should we be doing it? That probably won't matter after a while. They'll just go ahead and do it anyway. I mean, the whole idea of de-extincting species and cloning, human cloning, I mean, who amongst us doesn't believe that human cloning won't eventually happen? And you're absolutely right, Jess. They'll probably, when they're cloning people, give them the option to remove certain aspects. Like they'll say, well, you have in your genome, you have a disability, or you have ginger hair or whatever. Do you want to get rid of that? And we'll give you a nice new, better, so-called better version. So it enters into that really scary territory of where you're of designer creatures and designer humans, and it wouldn't at all surprise me if we saw that kind of stuff happening in our lifetimes.
Yeah, that's right. I think you're right. I think people will go ahead. It's already happening. Yeah. Donna and James, do you have any thoughts on these kinds of issues?
I think the question of why came up for me quite a lot as I was writing Fauna. And in thinking about why, I thought about the kind of attributes of Neanderthals and what they had that we don't have. And, that kind of strength, the strength that they have is the reason that, that's the reason why they're genetically engineering this child. But, I don't think it really matters why. I agree with Chris that, it doesn't really matter why. We're going to do it anyway because of the glamour, because the idea is just so alluring that, if we can, then we will. And someone will find a justification for it somewhere.
I think so, yeah. Yeah. What about you, James? Have you thought about these issues? in your research and your writing?
Yeah, no, I have. And I agree with both Chris and Donna that, I mean, it seems to me that once that genie is out of the bottle, you know, I mean, it, and there are now so many jurisdictions within which these things can happen that, you know, eventually it's just going to happen. You know, someone's going to do it in, you know, wherever, Kazakhstan. You know, if you can't get the sign off for it in, you know, Australia, you'll do it somewhere else. But it will happen. But I mean, my issue around the de-extinction stuff is that, I mean, I think there are probably arguments for doing it in some cases. But I also think what worries me about it is it's this kind of incredibly expensive, incredibly technological fix when to a solution, which is problematic on two levels. And one of them is that it would be better if we just stopped wiping animals out. You know, it's like, it would be much, much better rather than bringing them back to just stop killing them. But also, I think there's a real question around what it is that you're bringing back. And it's one of the things that my novel's about, is this kind of sense that what an animal isn't just its kind of biological kind of nature. It's its whole way of being in the world. It's culture. It's you know, kind of affinities and kind of connections to the world around it. And I'm not sure you can bring that back. You know, so what you're bringing back is not the animal. You're bringing back a kind of biological thing. And there's a kind of, you know, Chris talked about putting mammoths with elephants and bringing them up, but they're still not really mammoths, are they? Because they've lost their mammothness. They've lost their mammoth culture. And, you know, if once there's 200 of them, presumably there'll be a new thing, which is being a mammoth now. But, you know, because things adapt and change. But we're not bringing back mammoths. We're creating a new thing, which is a mammoth.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, and I did like that part in your book when you talk about the trees and the culture of the trees as well. I mean, that context. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Okay, I don't have any more questions, unless you have anything that you want to add. No?
I have a question for Donna and James that I've been sort of wanting to ask them for a while, if you don't mind indulging me.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking recently about human cloning and the idea of that happening. How do you both feel about the notion of, let's say you were cloned, right? And a new version of you was born. How would you feel if that happened? Would you rather that happened after you were dead or while you were still alive, where you had a chance to essentially parent the child that was you? And it raises this interesting topic of, let's say you're dead when the child is born. You'll still be able to communicate with it because, you know, the child will have access to your books and records of who you were. That child will be a new version of you, but that it will be aware of the old version of you. And that gets more complicated if the clone is born whilst you're still alive, where you have a chance to actually help raise the child that is you. I wonder how you both feel about that.
I find that a very disturbing suggestion. But I mean, I don't know, but the clone would be its own person, wouldn't it? I mean, even if they surely by the time they got to 14, they'd think, I'm not going to be the person that you told me to be. And, you know, that kind of human refusal to be the same would come into play. So I don't know, but no, I wouldn't want to be raising my clone. I mean, although having said that, aren't children just that anyway? I mean, they're half your DNA.
I was thinking about my youngest daughter, who everyone tells me is like a doppelganger of me. And, you know, she's very similar, but also very different because she's brought up in a different time with different parents and different influences. So there will never be anyone who's exactly like you. But I do think it's a really interesting idea, and it gave me a bit of a chill down my spine. Is that your next work? Is that your next novel?
No, No, I just got thinking about it recently, and sort of scared the pants off myself when I thought about it, because we're all very nice people who would never abuse that, but there's plenty in the world who would love to get an exact replica of themselves and then raise it pretty much exactly how they were raised, so that they can live forever. And that disturbs me.
I think that idea might be on the
I'm
register.
confident that people are doing it.
Yeah, I think that idea might be on the register now, Chris. I think
I probably shouldn't have said it. Yeah.
I've just read a novel in which the book that won the Hugo this year, Arcady Matan's A Memory Called Empire. And one of the ideas in it is that people have developed this technology which basically sits it's like an implant they put in your brain. And what it does is it records your life. So you've got your kind of memories, and there's a kind of simulation of you. And then when you die, they take it out and they put it into someone else who's going to do the same kind of work. So they've then got all of your memories and everything which gets in, and your kind of personality, which they integrate into their own when they're about 20 years old. And then when they die, that integrated personality is taken out and put into the next person. So people's memories live for like thousands of years in the heads of other people, which is, kind of fantastically creepy when you think about it.
Yeah. What was the name of the story?
Memory Called Empire.
Okay, I'm going to check that out. Yeah, that's really creepy. Yeah, cool. Okay. All right, thanks everyone. That was fantastic. Anyone who's listening, please go out and buy the books of these authors. They're all great reads, and support your local bookshop at the same time.